Hello and welcome to the first episode of Tap into Politics, the show where we take a deep dive into the headlines, cut through the spin and fight back against right-wing misinformation. And here at Left on Red, we are on the front line of the fight back against the right. For too long, the left has been scared and remained voiceless, especially on key topics like immigration and the economy. It has never been more important to platform strong and confident voices on the progressive left. I am delighted to be joined by Mike Tapp MP, who has been leading the fight back against the woke right, both online and in Parliament. And joining us is Stella Tsantekidou, who is a fierce campaigner, strategist, and someone who is never afraid to say it how it is. Stella and Mike, welcome.
Thank you.
Today we're talking about something that's been dominating the headlines, and that's immigration. We know that working people feel the effects of mass immigration. Housing is scarce and expensive, and our precious NHS is at breaking point, and the cost of living crisis is spiralling out of control. But we're all tired of hearing that things aren't working. We can all see that for ourselves. And we're fed up of Tory MPs and Reform MPs on the opposition benches who don't have a proper solution to the problems that we're facing and solutions to fix the immigration system and give British people the hope and optimism that we all deserve. So let's start off by talking about what's happening in Parliament. Reform UK now has MPs, and they claim that they're different. They claim that they speak for the people. But Mike, let's be real here. Are Reform really on the side of working people?
Well, look, I've said this many times, and I absolutely mean it. And we've got to bear in mind, firstly, I come from a service background. You know, I've lived service, quite literally. I've been to war for this country. My family is very much patriotic family from service as well. My father was a police officer, my mum was a care worker. You know, all we've done is serve this country. And we've seen the Reform bunch, particularly Nigel Farage, by the way, wrap themselves in our great flag and be misusing it for their own ends. You know, they really are that sort of classic fake patriot who have tried to trick the country into thinking that they're patriots, and they're not. And I'll tell you why they're not. This is why they're not. This is their voting record. So Labour have come into government, and we are, of course, having to make some very difficult decisions. But we are putting into legislation things that will help ordinary, hard-working people on a day-to-day basis. So Border Security and Asylum and Immigration Bill, which obviously we're going to talk about more today, that's about securing the borders. It's about empowering the National Crime Agency, the Border Security Command, bringing in the likes of MI5 to take on the smuggling gangs. That's how we start to secure the border. Reform voted against it. You look at the Great British Energy Bill. Now that's aimed at bringing down our energy bills, which is impacting every single one of us, particularly since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We can talk about that more later as well. They voted against it. Employment's Right Bill. Now that's about giving ordinary, hard-working people rights in the workplace so they're looked after and they can thrive. They voted against it. Renters' Right Bill. So many people in my constituency are renting and across the whole country. This gives them more protection, more powers. Voted against it. And then perhaps the most offensive to working people and to the whole country is when we look at the amendment to the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill. Now, that amendment was around grooming gangs, and they exploited the abuse of children, the Conservatives and Reform, by the way. Within that bill were protections which came from the recommendations in the J report for us to implement and keep children safe. They voted for that amendment, which would have, by the way, wrecked that bill completely. So they haven't done anything to show me or to show the country that they stand up for working people. They wrap themselves in the flag and they don't mean it. And actually it's exploiting our great flag. We've got Nigel Farage fawning over Putin and saying things that essentially give Vladimir Putin a propaganda arm in the United Kingdom. That's offensive, particularly at a time like now when Europe's at risk. That's my rant over, Izzy.
Thank you, Mike. And Stella, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I was looking, there is this Twitter account that I follow, or X rather. It's called Reform Party UK Exposed, and they're doing a great job. They're doing God's, the Lord's work. What's
Yeah,
the
the Lord's
British
work.
phrase? Yeah. So they posted this video from 3 years ago, where Nigel Farage, he went on CNBC and he blamed the West for the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. He said, I have felt for 30 years, ever since the fall of the Berlin Wall, that we have made a huge geopolitical error. We absolutely promised the Russians that we could not extend NATO to the east, but we did. And he has been doing the same over the last couple of years. And what I have noticed online is when you go to online forums with Reform Party members, Reform Party supporters, more and more people are speaking out about this, and they are deserting the party because they feel like, wait a minute, this is really not what we signed up for. And you ask Mike whether Reform represents, the working people and whether they are genuine patriots. I honestly do believe that there are a lot of people in Reform who genuinely do love their country. A lot of them are misguided. Some others have some genuine concerns which have been ignored by large swaths of Westminster for a very long time. So they are right on some things, the people who have been attracted to Reform. But the problem is that the party is being led by people whose, for one, a lot of the people at the top of Reform are property millionaires. Extremely wealthy individuals who are completely out of touch with the realities of the people that they're saying that they're representing. For them, being working class is about your cultural signifiers and about perhaps the words you use, whether you ask people their pronouns, things like that. But that is not what makes you British. That's not what makes you working class. If you're an extremely wealthy individual whose practical interests lie with that of the elite, then I'm sorry, but I do not care whether you have a northern accent. You are part of the elite. And Nigel Farage, he's been obviously instrumental to popularizing GB News, which is a channel that both me and Mike often go. And the reason why we go on GB News, and I will accept invitations to go on every channel. I go on Talk TV. I obviously go on other channels and radio stations, but I will speak to anyone. Anyone who invites me, I will speak to them because I believe in engaging with people. I am a free speech absolutist. I don't believe in cancel culture. So I will often go on Nigel Farage's panel. I go on GB News all the time, but I have noticed a very sinister turn in the rhetoric that comes out of them. So I was on Patrick Christie's show last night on his panel, and he kept on saying, why is Keir Starmer and the Labour Party talking about Russia and Putin when our island is being invaded by immigrants? Which, by the way, on immigration, is immigration a problem that we should be a policy challenge that the Labour Party is taking seriously? Absolutely. And this is why we've seen all of the action that's going on under Yvette Cooper. And a lot of people find offense with the deportation videos that the Home Office has been putting out there, and the videos of police bursting into places where there are people, illegal immigrants working illegally. And I understand why this can be a bit hard to stomach for a lot of left-wing people. But for me as an immigrant, I think if you are going to migrate to another country, you come to the UK because you appreciate the respect for the rule of law. And that rule of law includes respecting the processes of that country and not trying to circumvent them and circumvent the decisions of the government. So this is something that I do think we need to get on board with. But to come back to the Russia issue, Patrick Christie's last night, and I've noticed that from other presenters on GB News, they keep on spinning the topic and they keep on trying to minimize the threat of Russia and pretend that the fact that Russia is basically ruining the Westphalia Convention, which is a miracle of the 21st century, that we have agreed as a global community that we will not accept any country invading the sovereign state of another nation. We have decided that this is how we want to live our lives because we looked at the horror of the First and the Second World War and the Cold War, and we decided that we do not want to have this ever again. And Mike, here I want, from your perspective, because of your background, I know that you shared in Afghanistan, am I right?
And Iraq,
so how, in Iraq, how does it feel to you to see these politicians pretending to be patriotic, which for me, when I'm being questioned like that on GB News, I'm wondering, is Russia paying you? Are you are you being bankrolled by Vladimir Putin while you are pretending to be a patriotic British?
Why are you doing their bidding?
Yes,
I mean,
exactly.
I find it actually quite offensive that that anyone is using the flag to then push what is essentially Putin's rhetoric. But I have to say, I have to make a point that this sort of attack, I suppose, on Farage and Reform is not about the voters. I have nothing against Reform voters, and those that I've engaged with across the country, in London, but in Dover and Deal as well, have been thoroughly decent people who've been let down by 14 years of Conservative government. And look, immigration is a big issue for them, but that's because of, like you said, it's the rules-based system and the rule of law that these people want to see being respected. And the fact is, look, 299 crossed on small boats in 2018. After that, 150,000. That was on a Conservatives' watch. They opened the borders. They completely destroyed our border security. And now, while we're working hard with sensible measures to bring that security back, they're pointing at us and saying, do it faster. It's like the arsonists who set the fire, and then the fire brigade come and they're stood there pointing at them, telling them to put it out quicker. It's actually quite disgraceful behaviour from the Conservatives, and Reform are just exploiting that, essentially. But they don't have the answers. And you look at the things they say they would do, they're unworkable. They talk about bringing the Navy in. The Tories tried that gimmick. The hulls on the ships that the Navy have in the Channel aren't low enough to intercept these sort of vessels, so already it's ridiculous. But at the same time, the Navy and the RNLI have a duty to rescue those that are in trouble at sea. And this brings me back really to British values, We're strong, but we're also thoroughly decent people. They're the people that I've met in Dover and Deal. They're the people that I've met across the whole country. And strength without decency is weakness. And that's what we see from the Reform leadership. It's utter weakness, it's false patriotism, and to a veteran like myself, and I'm sure many others, it's offensive.
Absolutely. We've talked a bit about what patriotism isn't, and as we're seeing that from Nigel Farage, it's kind of plastic patriotism. So they're very happy to wrap themselves up in the flag. But as someone who has served for this country, what does patriotism actually mean to you?
2 a.m. in a kebab shop. I'm joking, by the way. I was at the Kebab Awards last week, and I did put that into my speech around British values. Look, for me, British values is about courage, moral courage, decency, equality, fairness, strength. Now, this all comes from, for me, also military values, and it's what we served by, but also Labour values. And that's why I've come to the Labour Party after the military, because all of those values tie in nicely together. And I was brought up on this. My dad being a copper, as I've mentioned, there is that discreet patriotism and service there. But my granddad also, he was a gunner in Catalina flying boats, taking out Nazi U-boats, then went and worked for Coleman's Mustard. He was very much, the best of British. And what didn't happen with my family was, flag waving. It was a discreet patriotism. But I think for me, now that I'm a politician, I just want to celebrate my patriotism and say to people that it's good. It's good to love the country.
Yeah.
And actually, you've got to love the country to serve it.
Absolutely.
But you know what, Mike? I love that you said, you know, for your parents, patriotism was something discreet. And what bothers me about the insurgent right in the UK, and what the Conservatives are trying to be right now, and what Reform is doing, and GB News and all of these people is, they are embarrassed about a part of the British culture, which for me is extremely commendable. Being subtle, being considerate, being sensitive to other countries, and being humble is an amazing British value.
Yeah.
And there has been all of these like, oh, what does it mean to be English? What is an English ethnicity? Blah, 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 going on Twitter. And I posted a selfie jokingly saying I'm English because I don't think I'm English. I know I'm not English. I'm Greek. I will always be Greek, no matter how many years I live here. But I feel patriotic about the UK.
Yeah.
I feel patriotic about England as well. And I came here because I was specifically attracted to this country, and by living here I have come to love this country and its people. And for me, when I think about Britishness, the way that I came to know about the UK was when I was in Greece. I started learning English when I was a child, because in Greece we learn English very early on. We have a tourism-based economy, and I started trying to read English books, and the only English books that were around at the time, there was no eBay. It hadn't started yet. We didn't have e-commerce. There was just Jane Austen, like classical English novels. And that's when I started falling in love with English literature and with the English language. And then I came here when I was 18. And I take great offense with the way the debate has reached this stage where I'm asked to either defend my right as an immigrant to not be looked down on, or be unpatriotic about the UK, because I think it is a perfectly acceptable state to be in. And there are people in GB News and Reform who wish people like me were anti-British, but that is not the case.
Yeah, and that's what immigration and multiculturalism should be about. It's that integration, that's successful, bringing over the fantastic parts of Greek culture, but also loving this country. And actually, I think it's really important to say, because it doesn't get said enough, that I don't even like using the word migrants, but hey, that's what people who come over are, right? So the migrant sort of workforce and contribution, both culturally and economically, is very important. And our family members just come out of hospital, and every single one of the people that cared for him, including the surgeon, by the way, were migrants. And it was very professional. Same with my granddad when he was in a care home. I think there were some actually English workers there too, but the majority of them were migrant workers. And so there's that contribution that when we're having this conversation around secure borders and bringing immigration down, we must always recognise that. But we must bring immigration down.
If I can challenge you on that, if I
Yeah.
can play devil's advocate for a second, because for me, I'm immigration neutral. I think immigration is neither good or bad. The person who has been affected the most by me migrating to this country is my mother and my father. And for them, it's been a net negative. And the person who has benefited the most, of course, is me. For me, it's been an amazing thing. But a lot of people will say the fact that you have an NHS that is so dependent on migrant labor, and the fact that our economy is so dependent on migrant labor is a negative. And there are some parts of this argument that are actually correct, and I think that the Labour Party is addressing that, and you will know that better than me, and looking at why do we have an economy that is based on people being willing to take very low paid work? Why have we made the NHS so insufferable to work at that the doctors that we train here, they all want to go to Australia, and we have to, we are dependent on people from other countries moving here.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. It's actually a failure that we're having to rely on outside workforces, but we must recognise what a good job they are doing. But the fact is, we've got people out of work who should be going into work at the NHS. Engineers are leaving the country to go and work abroad when they should be staying here. And Keir Starmer is working on that, which is fantastic, to create British jobs for British people first, and then, of course, we fill the gaps with outside workforce.
I mean, this Labour government has really prioritised helping people into work, and that's been really good to see, especially because so many people and communities have just been let down. I'd like to kind of delve into some of the headlines that we've been seeing, and immigration has, of course, dominated and has for a long time dominated headlines, and as a result of that we have seen immigration be used as a little bit of a political football, and that's obviously incredibly wrong, because this is a really important issue and it affects people across the country, so to kind of politicise in that way is, I would say, frankly shameful. But one thing that has really stood out to me is this kind of focus on a few certain cases. So I'm sure we've all seen the case of the Albanian criminal who had his deportation halted.
Chicken nuggets?
Chicken nugget gate, exactly.
We all like chicken nuggets.
We all like chicken nuggets. Is that so? For context, this was an Albanian criminal who had his deportation halted because his son had an aversion to foreign chicken nuggets. This was something that has been mentioned in GB News because, quite rightly, it is ludicrous.
It's ridiculous.
And it points out that there is a huge flaw in our system. But I'd just be interested to get your thoughts. I'll come to you first on, do you think this is, is this kind of a cover-up for what is really a much bigger problem?
So I think there are two things there. For one, usually whichever case they pick up, you have to read the actual case, and then you realize that this was just something in the notes of the judgment. It had nothing, like it had no weight whatsoever on the actual decision. But on the other hand, and what I'm going to say is, I do think we should be allowed to deport people. And I do think, I do feel frustrated sometimes. I think that people are used to crying judicial activism far too often. I do think the UK I studied law, and honestly, it was one of the things that made me fall in love with this country more was studying English law, because in Greece, our law is codified. So to study law, you have to read really boring, like, codes, like boring text. But if you're studying law in England, you are reading the literary masterpieces that are the judgments by, sarcastic, super intelligent English judges. So it's a great subject to study. Anyway, having said all of that, you can't have a parliament who says, do this, and a prime minister saying, do that, and then the courts defying it. And when it comes to deportations, there have definitely been times where we've seen. Again, the UK has an amazing legal profession. We have amazing lawyers and amazing activists. And there have been times when we've had, people arguing on human rights basis that criminals should not be deported. And I think that this is something that we need to fix.
I'm very much in agreement. Look, what we inherited when we came into government was a system that had completely ground to a halt. So obviously we've spoken about the open borders we inherited, but it gets worse when you get into the Home Office. Actually, before the election, I was doing a bit of casework for a politician around immigration work, and there were people sat waiting, languishing for 3, 4, 5 years because there was no processing. With no processing, genuine refugees don't get the help that they deserve, but those who shouldn't be here stay here. Once you start processing, you can deport. And Yvette Cooper and Angela Eagle have started doing that already in just, 7 months, where they've got more decision makers in the Home Office. They're taking on more cases on a weekly basis. And that's how we've increased our deportations to 19,000 in just 6 months. That's a 25% increase under what we saw under the Conservatives, and 19% increase on foreign offender deportation. So a lot of work is going into this already, and it is very early. People do want to see a quick fix to this, and there isn't a magic wand. That we have to chip away at the sort of processing and what's going wrong. But I think my view is we've got to be hard on foreign offenders, particularly violent foreign offenders, and that will always come above chicken nuggets in terms of what you're looking at and whether they should be deported. And on that specific case, Yvette Cooper actually came down hard on that and said, this is ridiculous and we need to sort that out. But these things are a hangover from the Conservative days of letting that sort of ridiculousness happen and not having a system that's functioning, which we're getting on top of now.
Well, absolutely. And it would be really interesting to hear a little bit about some of the stuff you've been voting on, some of your experience talking to constituents and how that has shaped your work in Parliament.
Yeah. I mean, look, to start with, I have to talk about the immigration bill, if you don't mind, simply because we are on immigration at the moment and it comes up a lot on the doors in Dover. In fact, I'll start a bit further back to 2.5 years ago when I started my campaign in Dover, and I realised very quickly that people cared about insecure borders, and that's partly because it's very much the front line of where those folk are coming into. It's obviously developed from washing up or coming up onto the beaches on the boats to being intercepted and brought into the Western jet foil. But it does matter to people there. And I very quickly made it very clear to my constituents, or who were to be my future constituents at that point, that these people you're not racist. You can have those views. Don't worry, you can talk about it. I'm not going to counsel you. I will talk to you about it. And once I get into Parliament, I'll do my best to deal with it. Now I'm in Parliament and I'm working very hard with the government around this. Obviously, I'm not a minister. I'm very much a backbencher, which means my power is limited in terms of, forming the bill. But I've been speaking about it regularly with my constituents, with Yvette Cooper and Angela. And now I'm on the committee of the bill as it goes through each line reading to ensure that it gets through in its current form. And what its current form is, making sure the Tories and the SNP don't wreck it, which they've tried to with some pretty ridiculous amendments so far, is it will empower the NCA, the Border Security Command and the security services to essentially disrupt and get to the smuggling gangs before they commit their crimes. So it's taken on a counter-terror approach. MI5 do not wait for an attack to happen before they deal with the terrorists. They try and get there first. But often with these complex criminals and criminal gangs, it's difficult to get to charging point because they're good at what they do. But you've got the intelligence, so you know who these vile criminals are. So using the new legislation in the bill, the NCA, Border Security Command, police will be able to get to them and disrupt their activity. And we met with the Director General of the NCA last week, and he was very enthusiastic about it. So this bill is going to do a lot for securing the borders as we go forward, which is great stuff.
That is really reassuring to hear. Stella, as someone who is looking at this from more of a kind of strategy commentator perspective, how have you reacted to this, and also how do you think it's gone down with the people that you're speaking to, and of course viewers of GB News who may have been sceptical about Labour?
You mean immigration more generally and how it's going? Yes, it is actually. There is always this advice that's being given to centre-left and centre-right parties, which is you don't want to focus your attention on the topic that the extreme the extreme parties are trying to drag you into, because you will never be able to win on their grounds. And I think that Rishi Sunak saw that with his ridiculous slogan, "Stop the boats," which he regretted. He was on Rick Robinson this week, and he said that he regrets that slogan because it is setting you up for failure. And the truth is that for some things you cannot give. Some things are just not within the government's power. It's not in your power how many people are going to try to cross the channel. What's in your power is, are you making sure that you deport people? Are you making sure that you're processing claims? Are you making sure that you are reacting to this in a way that is effective and efficient and all that? But when I look at the UK over the last decade, and I'm thinking, take 2 steps back and look at the stuff that we have been focusing on for the last decade, but in particular over the last couple of years since Elon Musk took over Twitter. and tell me, hand on heart, are these the most important topics for British interests, for our national interests? When you look back at the last decade, is it really Brexit and immigration that is the UK's biggest problems? Is it not energy, infrastructure, and housing? Are these not our biggest problems on our day-to-day life? Sure, immigration, for sure. We should not have uncontrolled. Immigration should be controlled. We should only have people here who have the skills that we want, and they should not be allowed to bring as many dependents as they want. They need to be an economic net positive. That's good policy. But are you really telling me that if the amount of time we spend talking about Brexit and being dragged into debates about the votes, which are a tiny handful of people, like in terms of percentages of the people who come here, if we have spent all of that political capital, activist time, airtime on TV and radio, ink on our newspapers, discussing energy policy, discussing how and how are we going to reform planning so that we can start building nuclear power plants? How are we going to change our planning system so that we can have better infrastructure, so that we can have more housing? Where would our economy be right now? How much stronger would we be to fight the actual threats focusing our countries? Which takes me back to our first topic about reform and whether Nigel Farage is a patriot. What kind of patriot misguides people with genuine concerns, telling them their problem is about some bureaucrats in Brussels or about some desperate people crossing the channel when our gas and electricity bills are where they are and we don't have enough houses to live in and just basic everyday life.
Against all
Yeah,
the
exactly. I was going to say,
fix
those
these
are the
things, which is
topics that if you ask them what are your policies on housing, the NHS, they either don't have them or they have completely kind of misdiagnosed the problem. And they are just, I would say, out of ideas. They never had ideas to begin with.
Their solution to bringing energy costs down is to tax. Ban renewable energy, whatever silly policy they came up with.
Ban battery farms.
Like, did they just ask ChatGPT, what sounds like good clickbait? What is going to farm the most retweets and likes on X? What will make Elon Musk retweet it and say interesting? Full stop.
Yeah,
I do think that these other areas are vital, and fixing the NHS has been one of our top priorities, and that £22 billion worth of investment is revolutionary given what we've inherited, and I think we've got one of the best health secretaries ever, and it's only early, and Wes is already ensuring that we're bringing those waiting lists down, that target to have treatment from seeing a doctor to treatment in 18 weeks will save countless lives. And knocking doors, you hear some real horror stories of I had met one lovely lady in one of the villages near Deal who had been in hospital on a trolley in a corridor and actually died and was resuscitated. She looked great. It's quite incredible.
Wow.
And I said to her, what perhaps a silly question, what's worrying you the most at the moment? And she said, it's not actually about dying. It's not actually about getting ill. It's about going back to hospital, because she had that sort of fear that she would die because of negligence. Obviously, it's not negligence; it's being overworked and not having the facilities to look after all the patients. So that psychological damage it's done to pensioners, the way that Tories have run it into the ground is infuriating. Actually, it makes me really angry.
That reminds me of the time, especially during COVID, when I'm speaking to my grandparents and their generation. One of the biggest fears that they had was contracting COVID when there was a lack of the ventilators.
Yeah.
And that was really scary, this kind of fear of just not being able to breathe and suffocating to death because of a lack of ventilators and a lack of that kind of critical infrastructure.
Yeah, it's awful. And housing's a similar response on the doors. The amount of kids well, I say kids, 30-year-olds who are living at home with their parents, you know, simply because they can't afford to move out is quite astounding. And the NIMBY element of this, right? I've had many people say, I don't like that estate there being built close to where I live. And you say to them, have you got kids? And this doesn't always work, but it often does. And then they say, yes. Do they own a house? No, can't afford it. You know, some of them are even living with them at the time, or often they're out renting and at extortionate prices. So that it's so important that we meet those targets, 1.5 million houses. But we, of course, must try and avoid green belt as much as we possibly can. And that's where that grey belt and brownfield sites are so important for us, you know, hitting that target. But also ripping up the planning laws and streamlining, getting more planning officers in there and getting rid of that bureaucratic nonsense that holds us back from progressing. And we're getting there, and there's some really good legislation that will see us get there.
Absolutely. I think the point around speaking to parents who has your child moved out is really important, because obviously people want independence, and being able to afford your own home is so important, especially when you have a rental market which is just so exploitative. So having predominantly young people pushed into that is unacceptable. But also what I find quite effective on the doorstep is saying, well, okay, so you want your child to move out, of course, but do you want them to be forced to live somewhere really far away because that's the only place where they can afford to buy a house? And of course the parents don't want that. They want their child to go off to university, but then have the security and the freedom and the choice to come back to the place they grew up in and buy, should they want to do that. And it's about giving young people the choice of over their own futures. So I think it'd be really interesting to talk about something else which has also been dominating the headlines recently, and that is it's Ukraine, and in particular the recent discussions between Zelensky and Trump and Vance. And I think, we could all agree, watching that conversation, it was very, very distressing. And it was nothing short of a disaster. But one thing that did really kind of shine through was Keir Starmer and his leadership. He really came into his own and stepped up as honestly, I would say, leader of the free world. It'd be really interesting to get your thoughts on how you think Keir has done and his position.
He's acted as a true statesman, hasn't he? And but really careful, delicate diplomacy. And I said at PMQs on Wednesday that all of us in the House need to bear in mind that everything we say could become a part of that diplomacy. So we have to be really careful. And we're not commentators as politicians, and we don't have to tweet in response to everything that's said. We don't even have to give an opinion on everything that's said. It's about what's the end goal. And the end goal here is peace in Europe, but security for Ukraine and security for Europe. And the way we get there is we work closely with our close friends in America, but also we accept that what Donald Trump is saying around over-reliance on the US military is right. And we have over-relied. So we must increase our defence spending, and others in Europe need to do the same. And I'm really pleased to see Keir Starmer leading on that as that sort of bridge between Ukraine and the United States, but also leading the coalition of the willing in Europe to ensure that we've got Ukraine's back, and wherever this peace deal is agreed, we ensure that Putin can never do what he's done to Ukraine again. And that includes Estonia, where I've got family, by the way, all the Baltic states, Finland. Anyone bordering Russia should feel safe at the end of this deal. And I think that's what we're working towards. I'm really proud of Keir Starmer.
You said something very interesting there, Mike, which I think is very, very important. And I think perhaps because of your military background, you understand it better than others. Everything you're saying in Parliament and everything that is being said on the British media as well, Donald Trump is watching, Putin is also watching, which is why I'm so frustrated and disappointed, but not surprised, at all of the right-wing commentators and politicians who are criticizing Keir Starmer for increasing our defense spending and talking about the defense capabilities of the UK and wanting to publicly air exactly what is the weaknesses of the British defense capabilities. As if this is a private conversation, as if our enemies are not listening to everything that we're saying. We have a war on our footsteps. We are going into a very dangerous time. And there needs to be some kind of national unity, in which we also understand that these are no longer private conversations, and morale really does matter. The morale of the country really matters. The morale of the alliance matters. Visuals matters. So, but they think that they're weakening the Labour government, but really they are weakening the UK as a whole.
Yeah. What I will say, though, is that I'm really pleased to see, in general, a united house, which is really rare, isn't it, that we get that.
GB News did not like that, though.
Well, it's just, but I think in times of crisis and emergency, we come together. And we've seen that with the Conservatives and the Labour Party and the Lib Dems, although they've poked a little bit. But in general, we've got that united house around what we're doing and why we're doing. And that's really encouraging, because that's how we, get to peace in Ukraine, by getting behind Keir Starmer, really.
Completely agree. I mean, I personally was disappointed to see Kemi Badenoch fawn over JD Vance a bit, which was a bit in contrast with how she's behaved in the House. It does make me think that maybe she's been told to present a bit more of a kind of unifying, put a unifying face on, but deep down, I mean, she just always wants to spar with Keir. So I think that, for me, was disappointing. Interestingly, we have seen how the right-wing media has, the right have dominated the media, and we have, of course, seen Reform UK grow. It's undeniable. They are posing a political threat to the Labour Party, to the Conservative Party. And it would be really good to have a bit of a discussion about how we fight back in terms of the media. How do we regain control of the narrative? And how does the left cut through and actually reach working people and tap into the issues? To make that's going to be a next segment. Tap into the issues that affect them.
Do you want to go first? It's up to you.
What I would say is, what has been very disappointing and difficult for me is that because since Elon Musk bought Twitter, and generally there is a big lack of funding in terms of media, and the only media that at the moment, the only papers that get saved, basically, they usually have to depend on very, very right-wing people buying them. So you still just have the Murdoch family. You have Jeff Bezos, who bought Washington Post in the US, and recently he has announced that from now on, whoever writes for Washington Post will have to be advancing the free market agenda. And then here in the UK, you have GB News, who are, you have Sky having to fire, I don't know how many of its staff members, and then you have GB News, who they are saying at least that their ratings are better than Sky News. And you have all of these centrist and progressive people who are abandoning SIP on Twitter and on all of these other media, and they're just listening to centrist podcasts, and
Stay.
And I'm thinking, what are you doing? Like, I log into Twitter, and the misinformation that's there. For example, there was this sentencing guidelines kerfuffle yesterday where they started talking about two-tier policing again, which is complete nonsense, and there was nobody making the case against the right-wing narrative. There was nobody on Twitter. I went on Blue Sky, which is supposedly with all of the progressive people have gone, but there was no discussion on that as well. And I'm thinking, how are you going to get cut through unless you are willing to make the same arguments over and over again? And if I have learned anything in the last year, is that in politics, you cannot take anything for granted. Even if you think racism is bad, is a universally accepted political dictum, think again. You have to be making the argument over and over again.
Yeah, exactly. Keep fighting and stay in the spaces that we don't feel particularly comfortable being in. If I was ever asked to, write a piece, let's say, for the Guardian or the Daily Mail, I would take the Daily Mail, and that's not because I don't respect the Guardian, but it's because probably going to vote Labour anyway. But that doesn't mean we take them for granted, by the way. We love them and we've got to embrace our core voters. But we have to reach out, particularly to swing voters who in one election could vote Labour, in the next could vote Reform, in the next could vote Conservative. They're the people who decide elections, and they don't tend to be reading The Guardian or The Mirror. They tend to be reading The Sun, The Daily Mail, and possibly watching GB News as well. So, fight on the turf that we should be fighting, but also treat people with respect and decency. Remember our British values. Don't call people racist. Look, if you're talking to somebody who is of that ilk, you're not going to change their mind. Move on. The targets are those who are decent people, and the majority of people are. And that's how I think we win this argument over time.
Definitely. I think it's also interesting as left-wing Labour voices. I mean, this isn't our first time fighting populism. Those of us on the moderate wing of the Labour Party did take back the party from hard left populism. And I think what really was vital to that was actually meeting voters where they're at and going into the communities, knocking on doors, and really just trying to understand why people vote the way they do, why people don't vote. That's also really important. And we are seeing incredibly high levels of voter apathy. That was, for me, over the general election, just the standout thing. Yeah. So many people completely given up faith in politics, in politicians. And I understood it. When someone told me that on the doorstep, when I heard it time and time again, my first thing would be to really acknowledge and actually agree with them. Yeah. As a young person, going into, I was a candidate. It was my first time voting in general election, and I happened to be standing in it. And I said time and time again to the people on the doorsteps who raised these concerns, I don't see myself as a politician. I'm 21. I'm doing this because I'm really scared about my future. Every conversation I had with someone who raised this issue, they did actually say at the end of it, I'll give another go. I will vote one more time. It's really important that we do work so hard to restore that faith in politics, and ultimately what will restore that faith is delivery, and it's making promises, keeping to the promises, and real tangible change to people's lives. It would be really interesting just to hear your advice to our listeners who are on social media and seeing this misinformation, Stella, as you mentioned, and probably feeling a bit disheartened, a bit concerned really about the future of social media and the future of the right-wing media. What would your words and advice be to them?
I would say, like I said earlier, make sure you're remembering Labour values and British values and remain decent. There's many people that it is pointless engaging with, and you need to recognise when it's pointless. But also the complexities of social media means that if you're commenting on something, actually because of the way the algorithm works, it means it's going to get more attention. So you need to make a decision whether you do fight that fight, or whether you perhaps screenshot it and post it and then put your sort of spin on it or your opinion on it. So you have to be careful with social media, because actually fighting can amplify the voice of those that shouldn't be amplified. It's really tricky. But in general, be decent. And if you're a Labour member, get out on the doors, have some fun, get involved, whether it's younger, get involved with the students, make sure you go to some socials and enjoy politics, because it's not all boring and negative. We have a lot of fun along the way, and I think get involved in that as much as you possibly can.
Absolutely.
What I would say, Issy, and I do, you know that we come from slightly different parts of the party. Not that I'm probably disloyal to all of them, and probably because I'm not from this country, I guess. So I guess the immigration skeptics are right. But because I never had a specific wing of the party that I identified with, and I did work for the Labour Party. I worked for Labour MPs who were very close to the previous leadership, and for me, I embrace all the wings of the Labour Party. I think they each have their place, and I embrace all wings of the left and of the progressive causes more generally. I find intellectual fulfillment in even parts of liberalism that some people would not consider to be left-wing. And I do consume material from a very broad ideological ideological, I guess, ecosystem. And for me, this has helped me because I think you can become, if you're very stuck on just a very specific group of people winning all the time, you're going to be very disillusioned and you're going to be very, very disappointed. But for me, having your core values at the heart of everything is going to help you to just stay within the camp. And this is why at the stage where we're in right now, like we're talking about racism, for example, the division on racism is not about whether you are left-wing or right-wing. Is, do you understand what racism is? Do you believe racism is a bad thing? Or do you think that racism has been a conspiracy all along and that there is only racism against white people or something similar, which is something that I've heard from people? If you are against racism, then on this topic, we are on the same side as far as I'm concerned. And if we learned anything from the more difficult years for the Labour Party when we were in the opposition, is how important it is to keep everyone within the fold, as you said, Issy, going to people and begging them, telling them, look, I get it. This is super frustrating for you. You are disappointed, disillusioned. But don't leave, stay and fight. Because there is a future, and here we are now. But our job is not done now that Labour is in government. Actually, our job is only just beginning.
I think I really like that stay and fight. I think that's a good mantra for our viewers and for all of us involved in the Labour and progressive movement. If you have any final thoughts?
My only final thought is around British values, which probably won't shock you, and my belief as to where that sits on the political spectrum. I think far anything rejects British values. And it's no coincidence that Jeremy Corbyn and Nigel Farage got very similar views on Putin.
I do.
That's my end thought.
Thank you, Stella.
I just think pluralism for me is the most important thing ever. And, you know, whether it's Jeremy Corbyn or Nigel Farage, they are clearly, neither of them was suited to be a leader of anything, let alone the country. So pick and choose what you think they're right on and work on that, and then reject everything else.
Thank you. Well, that's it for our first episode of Tap into Politics. If you enjoyed it, please like, share and subscribe the video and keep fighting for the truth. Mike and Stella, thank you so much, and we'll hopefully see you next time.
Thank you. Pleasure.